Watchtower forever. The tower never let him go. Elias Fairmont had always joked about that with the fishermen, how people mistook devotion for imprisonment. But the joke had thinned into a principle over 32 winters. He walked the stone spiral each dusk with the sort of ritual that keeps weather and wandering thoughts from meeting, polished the lantern as if its glass might scold him for neglect, and logged the horizon in a cramped ledger whose ink had the patience of tide lines. The village slept somehow safer, for his small, bright witness began with a sound like a coin dropped into well water, muffled, perfectly centered, a discontinuity in the familiar hum of sea and gull. A logger repairing the cliff path found a loose slab, and while fretting with crowbar and muttered apologies, revealed a seam in the highest floor, an iron plate that had been flush with the ceiling for as long as anyone in Hallow's Bend remembered. He thought it was an old repair and nearly left it before curiosity made him pry. The plate gave with a reluctant groan. They called Elias. He climbed with a different gait now, the ritual replaced by a kind of anxious archaeology. The plate hid a hatch no ledger had ever referenced, a tiny door banded in rust, a keyhole that refused to show itself in any old photo or memory. When Elias lifted the hatch, a breath of air that smelled like old cloth and cold pages exhaled from above. Tucked inside, as if left by a precise hand, lay a tiny iron lockbox without maker's marks, and a scrap of paper with a single line: "Make room." The lockbox refused explanation. Its lid resisted, and then revealed nothing more than blank as dusk, no jewels, no relic, only a whispering shadow at the bottom, and a coldness that traveled from the metal into Elias' palm. He brought it downstairs and set it beside the lantern, like a new and peculiar instrument. At first, the changes were almost kind. A neighbor who had fretted unread letters found one answered in a tidy hand overnight. A broken oar in the cove mended itself by morning. Small absences filled, as if someone were tidying a room they believed belonged to them. Then names began to slip, not like a storm taken by fog, but more private, like someone mishearing a fine line of poetry. Mrs. Harlow, who baked at the corner, stopped remembering the middle name of her late husband. Children could not recall the name of the old boat that used to bring sardines at dawn. Elias would ask a thing aloud and watch the village answer in trembling guesses, as if everyone carried a smudge where a proper word used to live. He wrote observations in the logbook with a hand that quivered. Cassandra Marlowe arrived with a recorder, and not all the bravado her byline suggested. She believed stories, but she believed in the art of doubt more. "People forget things," she said, leaning into the tower stairwell. "But not everyone forgets the same thing at the same time." Elias wanted to tell her about the box's cold, and the way the lantern's flame sometimes seemed to pause mid-flicker. Instead, he showed her the logbook. The lines were not all his. Margins contained other hands, slanted, neat, misspelled, and erased in places, as if someone had been practicing the same prayers again and again. They tried to lock the box away. They wrapped it in oilcloth, shoved it into a chest in the attic, and then from there into the circumference of memory, where people put lost umbrellas. For a week, the village breathed like someone trying to sleep after a nightmare, tense but hopeful. On the 8th night, the bell in the chapel tolled without cause, a slow, hollow sound that made dogs stand in doorways and children clutch blankets. And when the bell left the air, 2 street signs had switched names, and a grandfather had, quite suddenly, forgotten the name of his youngest daughter. Elias' dreams grew crowded. He dreamed the tower stairs extended beneath the sea and above the clouds into rooms that weren't his to climb. He woke with phrases on his tongue that had no place in Hallow's Bend, cities he'd never heard named, faces whose smiles fit the wrong weather. He began crossing the margins of the logbook with a pen as if that might anchor things, writing each morning the names of people he feared losing. The ink bled a little, as if the paper itself were exhaling moisture or memory. At a council meeting, they spoke of closing the tower for good, of ticketing a stranger from Hallow's Bend who might otherwise take it as a relic. Elias listened as if a third person were discussing the shape of his chest. Cassandra asked a sharp question. Who would we be without what we remember? No one answered. The proposal passed with a hollow majority, and yet there was a visible unease, like people who both want to eradicate a problem and fear the silence that will follow after it's gone. The lockbox remained unaccounted for in the attic. When a child failed to call for a lost kitten, the village found it shattered into a mosaic of small absences. Every picture of the animal was fogged at the edges. Every voice that remembered it stumbled like a record skipping. People began waking to find small personal things missing. A locket no one could recollect buying. An old photograph whose faces matured into strangers by morning. Each vanish was tiny enough to be dismissed, but persistent enough to erode the architecture of trust. Fear wasn't loud. It was economizing, quiet and efficient. Elias climbed alone that night, certain that solitude would clarify, or perhaps that he deserved to fail privately. The attic hatch groaned open, and the lockbox sat where they had left it, folded into shadow as if it had never wandered. He lifted it, and this time there was a small weight inside, a single slip of paper, precisely folded, with a list of names, some he recognized, some not, and one at the bottom in a hand he wished he could forget. At the top, in letters that tightened his throat, the same economy of instruction: make room. He followed the paper's list, because refusing felt like asking the sea to cease. Each name corresponded to a prodigal memory. He set out to make room, for a recipe returned to a widow's hands, a melody hummed back into a street singer's mouth, an old marriage certificate restored to a dusty drawer. The village breathed easier as a patchwork of recollection stitched itself in discreet places. But making room was not always restitution. It was an exchange. For each thing returned, another small corner of the past emptied an address, a melody, the middle name of someone's child rearranged like furniture in a house trying to fit a new guest. On the final night, Elias walked to the lantern chamber with the logbook and the last folded slip. The flame held its breath. He set the names beside the glass and felt, for once, the weight of silence as a living thing. The tower seemed to lean inward, listening. He could lock the attic, sink the box back where it hurt no one by simply not remembering where it was, or he could write his own name on the list, and make room for what that would require. The village outside buzzed with a new kind of contentment, terrified, grateful, forgetful, and Elias realized the choice wasn't about saving them, but choosing what he would be willing to forget. He wrote his name neatly, the scratch of pen louder than the creak of any stair. The ink stayed wet longer than it should have. He folded the paper, slid it into the lockbox, and closed the lid with a deliberate smallness. The next morning, the village had smiles they could not name as suspicious, and an old friend of Elias stopped in the lane to call him by a name that had once belonged to a distant cousin. When Elias tried to correct him, the correction felt like fraying the seams he had already sewn. He walked the spiral that evening with a lighter step and a ledger whose margins were a little thinner. Years later, travelers would come and talk about how Hallow's Bend had once been a place of old stories and small miracles. They would mention a watchman who kept the light so long he seemed part of the tower itself. They would remember, if they remembered at all, an odd phrase once carved into a lintel above the hatch: "Room the Watchtower forever," which made as much sense as sea mist or a crossword clue. Elias' ledger survived in a spare drawer. Its margins held other hands, other trades, the quiet accounting of a town that had bartered a few names for the comfort of a remembered morning. The last page was blank, and that, perhaps, was the most honest thing of all.